Welcome to Mariposa Rising. I'm Dr. Charissa D Pizarro, an Afro-Latina clinical psychologist, CEO, and nonprofit founder. This is where mental health, culture, and power intersect. We examine how power operates in systems, culture, and within ourselves, and how transformation begins when we reclaim our voice. This is Mariposa Rising, where healing is power. The information shared on this podcast is for educational purposes only, and it is not a substitute for therapy. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, episode 2. Last episode, we started to talk about silence and some of its factors, some of its aspects. So silence isn't just something that just happens. It's not something that we choose. Silence can be learned. Oftentimes it's inherited, which means it's passed down through the generations. And oftentimes it has to do with survival if it's passed on, and safety. So way before we have the language for trauma, we learn what we can and cannot speak to keep ourselves safe. I mean, part of being a human is to find a way to keep safe so that you can survive. So think about a baby. A baby is born and they cry. Nobody can tell them don't cry. That's how they express what they need. But as a child grows, they get taught by their environment. And of course they learn speech, but they get taught when not to speak, when to speak, and what happens sometimes if you speak, depending on the environment in the home. In my work as a psychologist, I've learned that silence, you might think is something empty, but it's not. It's actually full. Silence could be full of fear. Silence can be full of anxiety. It's full of things that we wish we could say, but oftentimes we can't. So let's talk a little bit about culture and how it affects silence, how it perpetuates it. In many cultures, silence is a sign of respect. In my culture, for example, deferring to elders and remaining silent, whether it's when they're talking or when they're scolding you. Actually, I'll give you an example. My grandfather, the matriarch of the family, we couldn't even look him in the eye, and that was a sign of deference and respect because he was the elder. So not only would we have to stay silent, me being his grandchild, his children, even his wife, we had to defer to him and remain silent. Children now, we've raised them to speak their minds, which is great for this next generation, but that's not how we grew up. And culturally, it's still often a sign of respect to remain silent, to defer to the other person, to the older person often, or to the patriarch, which is the male in the family. So culture molds silence a lot and it reinforces it. A lot of times it's how families survive, especially when there is trauma. If there is violence, you're shamed into being silent. You're also silent for survival because if you say something, you will get in trouble. For example, I see a lot of children with trauma in the home and they don't talk about it in school because they know that they'll get taken away. And sometimes when they do talk about it in school, indeed what they feared happens and they get taken away from their parents, and to them, although it's for their own safety, it's a punishment for them. Other ways that silence gets reinforced in families is what happens in our home stays in our home, or like in English there's a saying, don't air out your dirty laundry out in public. And even sometimes when it's something positive, like you go on vacation, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and things of that sort. So sometimes you're just taught to stay quiet. Sometimes there's dire consequences for talking. And I say this jokingly, but also seriously. If I would have spoken back to my grandparents or my mother, I would probably not have teeth right now. Yes, it was a different generation, but that's how I was raised. And for some people, that is still the case. And that's not how I raised my child. And we'll talk about more of how you empower your children later, because we need to unlearn what we learned before. So I'll say that again. It's very difficult, but we need to unlearn some of what we learned before. Not everything. I mean, we have very valuable information, and it has kept us and brought up to the point where we are now. So that's great. But some things we have to untangle and let go of. We can figure out together what those are. So in the case of trauma teaches you to hide, to keep it to yourself, to cry yourself to sleep, not to cry in front of anyone else. Even without using words, sometimes silence is stopped. And silence doesn't just live inside families. It's reinforced by systems, for example, schools, and the bigger community, the bigger society. When people stay silent, their power gets taken away. And part of reclaiming that power is gaining the awareness that you have been silenced. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a literal reclaiming of voice by physically letting your voice out, but it can just be gaining awareness about it, the knowledge that you went through something, and sort of taking that in, knowing how you have been harmed and how you want to express yourself. It could be, like I had mentioned before, in writing. It could be talking to a therapist. It could be talking to a friend. So there doesn't necessarily have to be like a confrontation or a conversation, although that would be ideal at some point, depending on the situation. So I want to give you an example of how trauma silences. And again, the more shameful the trauma was, the more conditioned a person is to staying silent. So I'll give you an example of a client that I had years ago. It was a 90-year-old woman of color. She was from the Caribbean, and she was acting out. I worked in a nursing home. She was acting out in the nursing home. I would go in, the nurses on the floor would refer their clients to me for different reasons. So this woman was referred because she was acting out. She was rude to the staff. She would try to hit some of the other residents, things of that sort. So I spoke to her throughout sessions, and it was a few sessions. You have to gain trust and build that alliance, the therapeutic alliance. But at some point she disclosed that she had been sexually abused for years as a child, and she had never, in her 90 years of age, which was when I saw her, she had never told anyone at all. And it was amazing, the transformation that I witnessed in this older woman. I was so proud of her. So the fact that she was able to tell me what happened, which is so difficult, was so brave of her. And even at her age and her generation, where she was taught to remain silent, not just about abuse, but about a lot of other things, because she also came from a country with a dictatorship. So she was taught to be silent, but she was able to do that. This woman changed, her behavior changed, her relationships with her friends. She made friends. She didn't have friends before because of her behavior. She was like a different person. And this was towards the end of her life, which made it was sad, but I was glad that she was able to do it at some point. It's just the power of even telling just one person, and I was her psychologist, yes, but just telling one person about something so horrible that happened to you, and to be validated, to speak out, to break that silence. It is just so powerful that it's something you need to experience. I probably can't convey that enough, how powerful it can be, how freeing it can be, especially when it's about trauma that tends to be shameful, like sexual abuse, physical violence, political violence. There's just so much that we're conditioned not to speak that we need to let out somehow. And again, I reiterate, it doesn't have to be that you scream it at the rooftops. It could be that you write it down, that you write a song about it, that you let it out somehow. Because being silent, eventually, it takes a toll. It takes a toll on your mental health. It can take a toll on your physical health. The cost of silence is very high. Trust me, I know. I couldn't talk about the fire for a long time. Like, it took me a while to even get into therapy, but to be able to talk about it, because there's so many feelings attached to it. And often, or I want to say almost always, you feel worse before you feel better. So part of breaking the silence feels terrible at first, most of the time, but then you reap the rewards. And this may sound a little cliche, but it is really a powerful experience, which I highly recommend. So how do you unlearn silence? How do you know if you're even been silenced? How do you know if you learned it? Where did you learn it? So let me ask you this. Have you been silent about something, and why? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a major traumatic event. It could be about a lot of different things. But think about it. What have you been silenced about, and why? If you could do something about it, doesn't necessarily have to be, again, screaming it out at the rooftops, but how can you let that out? Do you want to make an appointment for therapy? Do you want to tell your best friend? Do you want to write it in your journal? Do you want to write it down and then burn it or rip it in a paper? There's a lot of different ways for that to come out. The point is to acknowledge to yourself that something happened, that you were wrong somehow, and then to start the repair to reclaim your voice. So silence that at some point protected us, kept us safe, is something that probably no longer serves you right now, assuming you're not in the situation you were in before. And it has to be unlearned, and it can be done. I repeat, it is not easy, but it can be done. So finding your voice isn't about speaking louder. It's not about screaming at the rooftops. I love that analogy. It's about feeling safe enough to even acknowledge it to yourself. And breaking that silence is reclaiming your power. The silence may not have started with you, but it can end with you. We are cycle breakers. We are silence breakers. We are oppression breakers. We're reclaiming ourselves. Reinventing yourself if you have to, which again, not an easy task, but totally doable. So what silence would you break? I would love to hear in the comments. I would love for you to share your stories. See you next time.